How you doing, boys and girls? We got our M5OD apart. I got it in my super custom jig here. I'll show you the power flow of this thing, where all the shafts do, where all the gears are at, and what the gears do. So let's start with which shaft is which. This guy right here is my input shaft. If I take the clutch and slide it onto the front, I give the little clutch a spin, then the gears and things start to spin. So this is my input shaft. This is what attaches the transmission to the engine via the clutch. Okay, so let me yank this main shaft and stuff off. If you'll notice, the input shaft is pretty short. The only gear it has on it is a drive gear here that drives the counter shaft, or the cluster gear. It could also be called a cluster shaft. So, and I have a tendency to mix all those words up, so good luck with this. But that's my input shaft. So when everything's assembled in the transmission, anytime the engine's turning and the clutch is engaged, your foot's off the pedal, the counter shaft is spinning and the gears on it are spinning. Fifth gear in reverse in this particular transmission will probably stop, but because they're free floating on this shaft. So that's that part. And there goes my pocket bearing. All right, so my pocket bearing fell out. This is the bearing. It goes inside the input shaft. It allows it to spin on the output shaft, or maybe called the main shaft. Let's see if I can get it up here in the jig. All right, so this shaft here is my main shaft, or my output shaft. And if you'll notice, most of the gears that are on the shaft, these driven gears or speed gears, are actually not attached to the shaft. They just float on it. To engage these into the shaft, you have to move one of these sleeves over, which is on a hub. The hub is splined to the output shaft. The sleeve is splined to the hub. And then when you slide the sleeve over onto the speed gear, these little dogs on here engage into the teeth inside the sleeve, and that's what causes this gear to be engaged with the output shaft. Okay, so that's how that part works. In this transmission we have fifth and reverse, which are splined to the output shaft, the driven gears are, and then the actual drive gears are not splined to the cluster gear. We throw that fella back in here. And we have a hub and a sleeve to engage fifth and reverse on this particular transmission. Now then, this is your reverse idler. When we took this thing apart, I said it takes a third gear to give you a reverse action. So if I can sneak this guy in here, like so. Now trust me when I say there were no precision instruments harmed in the production of this custom holding unit here. So this is my reverse idler, and that allows me to give reverse action. And if you probably can't see it, but there's just a little bit of clearance between this gear and this gear for reverse, and they don't actually touch each other. All right, so let's talk about power flow now. We already covered that input comes from the engine here, which drives the cluster shaft. So this cluster gear, counter shaft, whatever you want to call it, these are actually the drive gears that are going to drive these speed gears. These will be driven, these will be drive. So little gear driving a big gear, that's going to be first, right? Lots of torque multiplication and very little speed output. So I have a little bitty gear here, which is actually driving this big gear over here. If I lock that gear onto the shaft with the sleeve, now we're in first. And let me put some marks on this so you can get a reference of how fast this thing's traveling. We'll put a little lubricate on here, and I'll give you a visual reference of what's going on with these shafts. So if you'll notice, my input shaft is traveling much faster than my output shaft. So that's first gear, lots of torque multiplication. We need to go a little faster. We're going to go and we're going to shift into second. Second is a little bit bigger gear, driving a little bit smaller gear. So we'll lock second onto the shaft. And if you'll notice, my input versus my output's going a little bit faster, but still the input travels faster than the output. So we're gonna go a little faster. Let's go into third gear. Third gear, we're gonna lock a little bit bigger gear, driving a little bit smaller gear onto the main shaft here through this sleeve. And then look now, we're almost going the same speed in and out. We're actually starting to get going a little faster in this car. So let's go to fourth. Fourth is kind of cool. There is no fourth gear in this transmission, okay? All we do is we lock the input shaft to the output shaft with this sleeve right here. So if you'll notice now, heck, they're pretty close to being lined up. Let's line those up, perfect. I got my 2 grease marks lined up, and I can spin them like crazy, and they always come back to the same spot. So fourth gear is 1-to-1, and there's no actual gear to do it. We just lock the input and output shaft together via this sleeve right here, and that's fourth gear for us. Now fifth is going to be an overdrive. Let's see if I can put this back in there. Fifth gear, or overdrive, let's go with overdrive. Overdrive is typically outside of the case of the transmission. So get your butt in there. Be nice. There she goes. One more piece for reverse, and we're off. All right. So fifth gear is outside the case. It's inside the extension housing. If you notice, I have a big gear driving a small gear. So my speed output is going to be very high, but my torque is going to just be very, very low. So we're going to lose torque, but we're going to gain speed. So when I lock fifth onto the cluster gear, now I get, reverse is being angry. Just get rid of them. That'll make it easier. All right, so if you notice, my input shaft is traveling slower than my output shaft. Okay, that's an overdrive. Now then, we don't have any torque multiplication, or we actually lose, we are multiplying torque, but we're losing torque. So a little bit of torque, little bitty teeth. First gear, lots of torque, big teeth. So you typically tell right away when you pop transmission open which gear is fifth, because it's got the super fine teeth. And usually which one's first, because it's got really coarse teeth. Let me spin this thing around. See if we can make it go backwards. Now, if we don't engage any of the speed gears to the transmission, we're in neutral. The input shaft or the output shaft can spin all day long, and there's no connection from the input to the transmission. First, just being grumpy today. Let's see if I can sneak it in there. Be nice. Drop the sockets on the floor. Okay. Get in there and stay. Don't be mean. So I'm going to engage reverse. I'm going to lock the drive gear to the counter shaft. There's a reverse idler gear here in the middle, and then I have my output gear, which is splined to the main shaft. So if you'll notice, I'm turning the input shaft one way, and the output shaft is turning the opposite way. So that's my reverse. And also, if you'll notice, my input shaft is traveling much faster than my output shaft. I have a lot of torque multiplication in reverse. So that's backwards. That's why we go backwards for reverse. This transmission has a output shaft speed sensor, and this little guy here is a tone ring for that. It has a BB on the shaft that keeps it from spinning. And so as this thing spins, as the output shaft spins, it can read vehicle speed based off of that, assuming we have traction. So that's my shafts and my gears and things that makes this transmission go. Okay, you ready to do some math? It's going to get complicated. Let's do some math on the gear ratios. And a transmission jack is not the best camera gantry, but at home, that's what we get. Put you about right there. Let's see what we can get into. Okay, this is my super awesome drawing of the transmission and all its gears and shafts and things. And if it looks out of proportion, it's just a problem with the camera and your screen. It's not my drawing, I promise. So my input shaft is here. It's got a gear that drives my counter shaft. that has all the gears for the counter shaft on it. There's my output shaft that has the speed gears on it, reverse and all that stuff. And then I have a reverse idler out here chilling on its own. And then this is my output shaft. Okay, so let's do some math. My input shaft has 24 teeth on it. And the driven gear on the counter shaft has 37 teeth on it. So if you divide 37 by 24, that gives you a ratio of 1.54 to 1. And if you didn't know, left-handed dyslexic people don't write that awesome. Now then, so every other speed in this transmission except for fourth, where we go 1 to 1, we have to multiply the ratio of these gears times that ratio. So let's do first gear. Let's get going here. So first is right up here. That's little gear driving a big gear. So in first we have 15 teeth down here, and it drives a 38 tooth gear. Did I get that? No, I got it right. So 38 divided by 15 is 2.53. 3. So I'm going to multiply 2.53 times 1.54, and that's going to give me a 390 to 1 gear ratio for first. So for every 3.9 revolutions of the input shaft, we get 1 output shaft revolution. So input, output ratio. Now then, why is that important? Let's talk about torque multiplication. First gear, it takes more energy to get the car moving than it does to keep it moving. So we need lots of torque for first gear. So my torque is going to get multiplied. So if my engine is, we're going to say it's 2,000 RPMs and I'm putting out 100 foot-pounds of torque, so I'm going to multiply that times 3.9. My 100 foot-pounds of torque input gives me 390 foot-pounds. I'm going to write pounds even though we know it's foot-pounds of torque out. Okay, so we had some serious torque multiplication there. But my speed, we're going to sacrifice speed. So for 2,000 RPMs in, divided by 3.9, that's going to give me 512 RPMs out. So 2,000 in, 500 out, that's pretty slow. But in first gear, we're not going very fast. We just need lots of torque to get the vehicle moving. So let's go a little faster now. Let's pick out second gear. Second gear is a 24 and a 35. So 24 teeth here, 35 teeth here. So we take 35, divide that by 24, that's going to give me 1.46 to 1. Multiply 1.46 times 1.54, that gives me a 2.25 to 1 for second. 0.25 to 1 for second gear. Okay? Now then, torque, it's going to get we're going to have a little less torque than we had in first gear. We're only going to have 225 foot-pounds of torque at 2,000 RPMs with 100 pounds of input. So torque went down, but let's see what happens to speed. If I take 2,000 RPMs divided by 2.25, that gives me 888 RPMs. So we went a little faster, 512 to 88, we went faster. We lost torque, gained speed. So let's go to third. My third ratio is a 31 and a 30. So let's go 31 here and a 30 there. Divide those into, they're almost the same. That's a 0.97 to 1. To multiply that times 1.54, that gives me a 1.49 to 1. 1.49 to 1 for third. Okay, so the input shaft goes around 1.49 times, 1.5 times to get 1 output shaft revolution. Our torque is going to go down again, our speed is going to go up again. So our 100 foot-pounds of torque of input becomes 149 pounds output. Now my 2,000 RPMs of input becomes 1,342 RPMs of output. I can maybe spell RPM. How do you spell RPM anyways? So fourth gear in this transmission, I said there's no gear, right? So fourth, we just lock the input shaft together for fourth. And there's no actual gear. And it's 1-to-1 output. So fourth gear is 1.0 to 1. I can't spell 1.0. What are the odds of that? And I can't spell 1 either. Okay, 1.0 to 1. Whatever I put in for RPMs, I get out. 2,000 RPMs in gives me 2,000 RPMs out. 100 foot-pounds of torque in gives me 100 foot-pounds of torque out. So that's my fourth gear there. All right, fifth is overdrive, right? So we're going down the highway now. We're cruising. We don't need that much power. We don't need that much torque to keep the vehicle moving, but we do need some speed, right? So let's speed the car up and slow the input down a little bit. For fifth gear, I've got a 52 driving a 27. We're gonna ride it on the teeth of this one. It is 0.52 to 1. If you divide 52 by 27, that's 0.52 to 1. That's kind of wild, 52 to 52. Multiply 0.52 times 1.54. For fifth gear, we get a 0.8 to 1/5. All right? So we're still going to multiply our torque by our ratio. So 100 foot-pounds of torque of input times 0.8, that only gives me 80 foot-pounds of torque out. So we have less torque out than we put in. But now check out what happens to my speed. My speed is going to get divided by that. It's going to be 2,500 RPMs out. So I only put in 2,000 RPMs, but I got out 2,500 RPMs at a lesser torque. So in a transmission, we're not really changing gears, we're changing ratios. In each ratio, we're trading speed and torque back and forth the whole time to try and meet the scenario that we're driving in, and the torque output of the engine, the torque demand of the driving situation. So that's our normal gears, 390, 225, 149. That's a pretty normal set of ratios. Now let's look at reverse. Reverse gets complicated, way complicated. So we got a 15 driving a 31, driving a 33. Oh, look, more math. Actually, 24 driving, 37 driving, 15 driving. Look at all the driving, lots of driven, lots of ratios. So 15 to 31, it goes in there 2.06 times. 31 into 33 goes 1.06 times. So 1.06 times 2.06 times 1.54 for reverse, I get an output ratio of 390 to 1. No, that's not right. 3.38 to 1. Excuse me there. All right, you can guess what the speed's going to be. It's going to be a really close ratio to first. Speed's going to go down, torque's going to go up, right? 100 foot-pounds of torque in is going to be 338 foot-pounds of torque out. 2,000 RPMs, which you must be flying in reverse if you're going 2,000 RPMs. That's going to give me 591 RPMs out. Easy enough? You guys can all do this in your head? All right, so do you need to know this? No, not even a little bit. What you do need to know is that with each ratio, we're trading speed for torque. That's the most important thing out of all this to know. How to do the math? No, we don't need to know how to do the math. I can't think of an application. Well, unless you're building custom stuff, you don't need to know the math. If the car's broken, put the one in it that matches the old one and rock and roll. But at least this gives you some understanding of what's going on in there, what's spinning and what's driving and what's not. All right, thanks for watching, guys.